You know how I've been getting ready for that big international conference?
Right.
We're getting ready for this deep dive.
Yeah.
I saw this video, North Korean troops.
Okay.
Supposedly, they're getting Russian gear.
Right.
And it got me thinking, with more countries getting pulled into this whole Ukraine thing,
Yeah.
what does it actually mean, when things escalate?
Right.
Because I don't know about you,
Yeah.
but nobody wants to be like
Yeah.
World War III.
Right.
But like some of the comments on this video were like
Mm-hmm.
straight up, this is it. This is how it starts.
Yeah.
And then other folks are like 10,000 troops. That's nothing.
Right. Those are the two ends of the spectrum.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do we unpack this?
Well, and it's understandable why people are drawing these comparisons to World War II.
Yeah. It feels
It's
very
very tempting to...
textbook, but scarier.
Yeah. This new Axis narrative, right? With Russia, China, North Korea, very tempting storyline. But as with most historical comparisons, I mean, they all have their issues, right?
Yeah.
And one of the big ones here is that during World War II, you had this shared ideology amongst the Axis powers. Fascism today,
Yeah.
Russia, China, North Korea. They have their own things going on. It's not like they're really unified in the same way.
So you're saying like the teamwork element.
Yeah,
It's
potentially.
a little less coordinated than it seems.
It's not the 1930s, right?
Right, exactly.
And you look at a country like China, their main motivation, it's economic.
Yeah.
They've spent decades building themselves into this global economic powerhouse.
So
And if they suddenly go all in with Russia,
that's a risky move.
there's a lot at risk there.
For sure.
I mean, we've seen...
And all the comments about how they might actually benefit from a Russia that's a little bit, I don't know, weaker in the long run.
Sure.
What's the real risk there for China versus like what's the reward?
I mean, for one thing, it helps China to have Russia at least somewhat strong. If Russia completely falls apart, that doesn't help their long-term game.
Right.
At the same time, if they openly support Russia militarily, you're talking about huge blowback from the West.
Yeah.
Sanctions, economic isolation. They don't want that either.
So it's a tightrope.
It's a very delicate balancing act.
And a lot of the discussion online actually mentioned one person even used the term vassal state.
Okay.
This idea that,
But-
Russia might actually become so dependent on China.
Become a puppet, essentially.
Yeah. Reliant on them
Right.
for everything.
Which, I mean, when you say vassal state,
Yeah.
you're talking about a state that is basically controlled by another state.
Right.
Politically, economically. Now, China might like having more influence over Russia,
Sure.
but they also don't want to have this completely unstable, failed state right next door.
Right, right. So it's
So there are limits.
a balancing act for them, but
Yeah,
potentially like really unpredictable outcomes.
definitely.
Now, let's talk about North Korea actually sending troops.
Okay.
They've sent weapons before,
Right.
but putting actual, boots on the ground
Yeah. That...
feels different. Like that feels like a very different level.
And it's a very different level of commitment, for sure.
Right.
And it's interesting that you picked up on that distinction because it is important. Sending arms is one thing, but when you're sending in actual soldiers,
Yeah.
that means North Korea has more skin in the game. If their soldiers are out there in combat, taking casualties, it's harder for them to just back away.
It's a bigger deal. And,
That is a bigger deal.
some of the comments I saw, they were comparing this to like the Iraq War,
Okay.
where, a bunch of different countries sent troops.
Right.
And it didn't automatically turn into
Right.
like, global whatever.
Or the conflict. Right.
But then other people were like, no, but this feels different.
Well, and it's tempting to compare it to Iraq.
It is, yeah.
But I think we always have to be cautious about directly comparing different historical events.
Right.
The Iraq War had different players, different goals, different contexts. We can't just overlay the past onto the present, even if there are some similarities.
That makes sense. And speaking of different perspectives,
Sure.
this whole thing about propaganda kept coming up in what I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
There are, people on all sides pushing these very specific narratives.
Right.
And it just reminded me that it's not just about like the actual fighting. It's also this like war of information going on at the same time.
It's absolutely a war of information as well.
Right.
And propaganda is a very powerful tool, and it's been used effectively for a very long time.
Yeah. And it makes you realize how important it is to be like a critical consumer of what you're seeing online,
Yeah.
especially in this age of social media where like misinformation can just spread like wildfire.
It spreads so quickly.
And one person even pointed out that the way World War II is taught in Russia is very different from how it's taught in the West.
That's a great example.
Right.
Because in Russia, they really focus on their own sacrifices, downplaying anything, any atrocities that the Soviet Union might have committed.
Right.
It reminds us that history is written by the victors.
Yeah.
And even accounts that seem objective can be influenced by who's telling the story and what their agenda is.
Right.
Absolutely.
It really makes you think about how much, like, our own understanding of history is shaped by where we grew up.
Right.
Totally.
Yeah.
But going back to what you were saying about propaganda,
Yeah.
what are some things, like, what should people be looking out for, especially online?
Well, I think one of the biggest red flags is language.
Okay.
If you're seeing language that's super emotional
Okay.
or really inflammatory, that's often a sign that someone's trying to manipulate you with propaganda.
So it's like they're trying to bypass your logic.
Exactly.
Just go straight for, like, the gut reaction.
It's all about triggering a strong reaction rather than presenting, evidence or a balanced perspective.
So if you find yourself getting, like, really riled up by something you're reading,
Right.
whether it's anger or even, like, super patriotism,
Yeah.
that's a sign to maybe take a step back.
Absolutely.
Be like, hold on, is
Yeah.
this...
Yeah. Am I being played here?
Exactly.
Another thing to consider is the source.
Okay.
Who's putting out this information? What's their agenda? Is it, a well-respected news organization?
Yeah.
Or is it some random website or a social media account
That's a good point.
that's known for just pushing a certain viewpoint no matter what?
It's so easy to get sucked into these, like, echo chambers online
Oh, yeah.
where you just see the same information
Constantly reinforced.
over and over again.
And you feel like everyone agrees with you, but really you're just seeing what an algorithm wants you to see.
Exactly. Exactly.
So it's really important to actively seek out different viewpoints.
Okay.
Even if they make you uncomfortable, even if they challenge what you think. Don't just stay in your own little bubble.
That makes sense. That makes sense. There were actually a few comments about how, like, Western media might be downplaying Russia's military capabilities.
Right.
Do you think there's any truth to that?
It's definitely possible. I mean, every media outlet has a perspective, even if they don't realize it.
Right.
And in the West, there's a tendency, to want to portray democracies in a more favorable light. But we have to remember that democracies can engage in propaganda too, especially during a conflict.
Yeah. That's a good reality check for sure. So if we're trying to be, like, as objective as possible,
Right.
what are some, like, practical things that people can actually do?
Well, one thing I always tell people is diversify your news diet.
Oh,
Don't just get your news from one place.
right.
Try different outlets, different countries even. See how different perspectives are covering the same events.
So it's like, get a second opinion,
Exactly.
but for the news.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to dig a little deeper. If an article makes a claim, see if they back it up with sources. You can even do your own research.
Right. Fact check it yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, we have so much information at our fingertips these days.
It's
We
incredible.
might as well use it,
Absolutely.
right, to actually be informed. Okay, so shifting gears a little bit,
Okay.
I want to go back to something we were talking about before, about, like, the personal stories
Yeah.
within this bigger conflict.
Yeah.
There were some comments that really stuck with me.
Yeah, I agree. Often those personal stories are what make these huge, complex situations
Right.
feel real and
Right.
remind us of the human cost.
Exactly. Like, there was one comment that said something like, these North Korean troops, they're just being used as cannon fodder.
Right?
And it's like, yeah, behind the headlines,
Yeah,
there are actual human beings whose lives are being completely upended.
absolutely. And it's a pattern we see throughout history. It's often the most marginalized groups who end up on the front lines, whether it's because of ideology
Right.
or just because they don't have the power to resist.
And with North Korea specifically, you have that added layer of, like, isolation.
Right.
People are even saying, like, imagine what these soldiers would tell their families
Right.
when they go back, if they're even allowed to talk about it.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, like, how does an experience like this shape your view of the world,
Yeah.
especially when you come from a place that's so closed off and you're suddenly exposed to something completely different?
Totally, totally. And it makes me think about those comments we were discussing earlier about, like, the possibility of some of these soldiers defecting.
Oh, right.
And it's like, obviously, in a situation like that,
Right.
there's a huge risk
Enormous risk.
for those soldiers
And their families.
and their families back home. Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's another reminder of how much is actually at stake here, beyond just, the military maneuvers.
Absolutely. It's about real lives.
Exactly, exactly. Now, I want to bring it back to you for a second.
Okay.
You're getting ready for this big international conference.
Yeah.
How do you think this whole situation, like especially with North Korea now involved,
Yeah.
how's it going to impact what happens there?
Well, it's going to be a major topic of conversation for sure. And I think it adds this whole other level of like tension,
Yeah,
urgency,
right.
because this conflict has the potential to really destabilize the whole region and
Uh,
even beyond that.
Totally. It's like a ripple effect.
Yeah.
So how do you even prepare for something like that, knowing that these issues are on the table?
Well, information is key, right?
Yeah.
I've been following the news super closely,
Yeah.
reading analysis from different experts, trying to understand all the different perspectives that are out there. It's also really helpful to brush up on the history
Okay.
of the region, especially the relationships between Russia, China, North Korea. That history is really important for understanding what's happening now.
So it's like you got to do your homework,
You really do.
which is kind of what we're doing here.
Exactly. And it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about being prepared to have these really nuanced and sometimes really sensitive discussions.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of nuance, one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the ethical dimension of all of this.
Okay.
Like you have a country like North Korea, which, they don't exactly have the best human rights track record.
Right.
And now they're sending troops to fight in a war that's not even theirs.
Right. And that's a really important ethical question to be asking.
Totally.
And it gets at this bigger issue in international relations, which is that there's often a disconnect
Yeah.
between the ideals of human rights
Right.
and the reality of how states actually behave.
So it's like what should be happening
Yeah.
versus what actually is happening in the world.
It's that tension.
And it can feel kind of disheartening
Oh, absolutely. It can feel really discouraging.
when you think about it too much.
But I think it's important to acknowledge those ethical dilemmas
Right.
without letting them completely paralyze us. We can still engage with these issues. We can advocate for change. We can hold our leaders accountable,
Yeah.
even as we recognize how complex and messy the world can be.
So it's about staying informed and engaged
Yeah.
and hopeful,
I think that's a great way to put it.
right? Even when it feels difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, now I want to shift gears one more time. Back to this idea of China and the role they're playing in all of this.
Sure.
Because we keep coming back to this balancing act that they're trying to pull off.
Right, exactly. They have these economic ties to the West,
Right.
but then this political alignment with Russia.
Right. And a lot of the comments were talking about how they might be able to benefit from a weaker Russia.
Right. It's this very delicate game of strategy.
Totally.
On the one hand, it benefits China to have Russia as a counterweight to the West.
Right.
But on the other hand, they don't want Russia to become so unstable
Right.
that it creates problems for them.
So they're kind of playing both sides.
In a way, yes. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to what China does in the coming weeks and months.
Okay.
Will they continue to just offer rhetorical support to Russia? Or will they take more concrete action?
Right, because that would have bigger consequences.
Exactly. If they start actively helping Russia militarily, they risk serious sanctions from the West. So it's a really tough position to be in.
Yeah, it's like a high-stakes poker game.
Laughs.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy.
Right. And we're all just watching, trying to figure out what their next move is going to be.
Exactly. And the stakes couldn't be higher.
For sure. Now, let's talk about something that, is kind of the elephant in the room. This idea that this conflict could escalate into a much wider war.
Right.
Is that actually a real possibility, or is that just like fear-mongering?
Well, it's definitely a possibility we can't ignore. But we also have to remember that when you have nuclear powers involved,
Right.
there's a strong incentive to avoid direct conflict.
Right, because the consequences would be unthinkable.
Exactly. So in a way, it becomes a game of deterrence. Each side is trying to avoid pushing the other too far.
But that doesn't mean that something could go wrong.
Exactly. There's always the risk of miscalculation or an accident.
Right.
And that's part of what makes the North Korea situation so concerning.
Yeah,
Because they're a bit of a wild card.
totally. They're unpredictable.
It's very difficult to predict how they might react.
Right.
If they feel threatened or if they suffer heavy losses.
So it just adds this whole other layer of, volatility.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to stay informed,
Yeah.
to have these discussions, to think through the potential risks, because the stakes are incredibly high.
Totally. Okay. Now, let's talk about the impact this is all having on the global economy.
Okay.
I mean, We've already seen energy prices spike, supply chains disrupted, inflation going crazy. It's hard to ignore.
It's definitely something that's affecting everyone, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
So what does that mean for, like, everyday people? What can we do to prepare for that kind of uncertainty?
Well, I think the first step is just being aware of the potential for things to get worse.
Okay.
Factor that into your financial planning.
Okay.
Build up your emergency savings if you can. Diversify your investments.
Yeah.
Be more mindful of your spending.
Those are all practical things that people can actually do.
Exactly. And stay informed.
Right.
Pay attention to what's happening with the economy so you're not caught off guard.
Knowledge is power, right?
Okay. Okay.
Before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we haven't talked about yet. The UN, the United Nations.
Okay.
What's their role in all of this?
Well, the UN's main job is to try and maintain international peace and security.
Yeah,
But it's important to remember the UN isn't a world government.
right.
It's an organization made up of all these different countries, and its power is limited by how much those countries are willing to cooperate.
So it's kind of like herding cats. Laughs. Yeah, sometimes it can feel that way.
Yeah,
But even though the UN has limitations, it can still be helpful.
Okay.
It can help facilitate dialogue between countries. They can provide humanitarian aid. They can monitor what's happening on the ground. Those are all important things.
So there's still a chance that diplomacy can work.
There's always a chance.
Okay.
It might be a long and difficult road,
Mm.
but it's really the only way to achieve a lasting peace.
That's a good point. Now, before we move on, I want to quickly address something that came up in the comments. Cyber warfare.
Ah, yes. The
Ah.
invisible war.
Right. A lot of people were talking about whether Russia might launch cyber attacks against, Ukraine's allies,
Right.
like the U.S. or NATO countries.
It's definitely something to be concerned about.
Yeah,
Cyber attacks can be just as disruptive as traditional military strikes, if not more so.
really.
Oh, yeah. They can take down power grids, disrupt financial systems, even sow chaos and misinformation.
Mm.
And it's often hard to figure out who's behind it.
Just like a whole other battlefield.
Things that we can't even see.
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
part of what makes it so dangerous.
Right, right. That's a little unsettling.
It is.
But it sounds like something that, governments are taking pretty seriously.
They are. And it's not just governments, businesses, individuals. Everyone needs to be aware of the threat and take steps to protect themselves.
Yeah, good point. It's a reminder that this conflict, it really can affect all of us.
Exactly. We live in a globalized world. What happens in one place doesn't stay there. It has ripple effects.
Totally. Now let's talk about another one of those ripple effects, the potential for this to become a proxy war.
Okay, so a proxy war is basically when you have bigger, more powerful countries
Right.
fighting each other indirectly by supporting different sides in a smaller conflict.
Right, right. And a lot of the comments were talking about whether this could turn into a U.S. versus Russia proxy war,
Right.
with Ukraine caught in the middle.
And that's a concern that a lot of analysts have raised. And there are definitely historical examples of this happening.
Like during the Cold War.
Exactly. The Cold War was full of proxy wars.
Right. So what are some signs that we should be looking for? How would we even know if that's happening?
Well, one thing to watch for is an increase in military aid.
Okay.
If we see the U.S. sending more advanced weapons to Ukraine and Russia sending more support to the separatists in the east, that could be a sign.
So it's like they're escalating their involvement,
Yeah.
but indirectly?
Exactly. And another sign is the rhetoric.
Okay.
If both sides start framing the conflict in more ideological terms, like it's a battle between good and evil,
Right.
that's another red flag.
So it's not just about what's happening on the ground.
Right.
It's also about how they're talking about it.
Exactly. It's about controlling the narrative, shaping public opinion, demonizing the other side.
It's all part of that information war we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so much to think about. Before we get to our final thoughts, there's just one more thing I wanted to say. We've been talking about this conflict in very, strategic terms, geopolitics, all that.
Right.
And I think it's really important to remember that there are real people at the heart of this.
You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the analysis and forget that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Behind all of the statistics and the headlines, there are human beings whose lives have been completely shattered.
Yes.
And I think it's important for all of us to remember that and to approach this issue with compassion and empathy.
Couldn't agree more.
Okay, so on that note, I think it's time for our final thoughts.
Okay.
Given everything we've discussed, what is the one thing you really want our listeners to take away from this?
I think the most important takeaway is that we live in a complex and interconnected world.
Okay.
What happens in one part of the world can have a profound impact on everyone else.
So we're not just citizens of our own countries, we're citizens of the world. And
Exactly.
that means we have a responsibility to stay informed, to be engaged, and to do what we can to make the world a more peaceful place.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by all of this, right?
Right.
Like the scale of this conflict, how quickly things are changing. It can feel like, what can I even do?
It's true, the stakes are incredibly high and the situation is very fluid. But I think it's important to remember that even in the midst of all this uncertainty, there are things that we can do, ways to navigate these really challenging times.
Yeah, I mean, feeling powerless doesn't help anyone. So where do we even begin? What can everyday people actually do to, I don't know, make sense of all of this and maybe even like contribute to a more peaceful future?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is to really be careful about the information we're consuming.
Okay.
We're bombarded with news and opinions constantly, and it can be really hard to separate fact from fiction, especially with social media.
Yeah, we talk a lot about propaganda. Do you have any like practical tips for how to spot it? Like how to know if you're being manipulated?
Definitely. One of the biggest giveaways is the language being used. If you're seeing language that's really emotionally charged, if it's trying to make you feel really angry or really scared or even overly patriotic, that's often a sign that someone's trying to manipulate you.
So it's like they're trying to bypass your logic and just go straight for that gut reaction.
Exactly. Another thing to look at is the source of the information.
Okay.
Is it coming from a reputable news organization, one that's known for accuracy, for being unbiased, or is it from a source that has a clear agenda that's known for pushing a particular viewpoint?
It's so easy to just consume information that reinforces what we already believe, you know?
Yeah.
Especially online, where those algorithms, they just feed you more of the same.
It's true, and it creates these echo chambers. You think everyone agrees with you, but really you're just seeing a very narrow slice of reality. That's why it's crucial to seek out different viewpoints,
Right.
even if they make you uncomfortable, even if they challenge your worldview. Don't just stay in your own little bubble.
That makes a lot of sense. That's like getting a second opinion from a doctor. You want to get the full picture.
You don't want to base your health on just one doctor's opinion, right?
Right.
Same with information.
So it's about being like an active participant in that process,
Right.
not just passively consuming whatever comes across your screen.
Exactly. Be critical. Ask questions. Do your own research.
Okay. I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about something that's been, it's been weighing on me throughout this whole conversation, which is the human cost of this conflict. It's so easy to get caught up in all the geopolitical analysis and forget that there are real people whose lives are being torn apart by this.
You're absolutely right. It's something that we should never lose sight of. Behind all of the headlines and the strategic discussions, there are countless stories of loss, of displacement, of incredible resilience.
Absolutely. And I think there were a few comments in the source material that really highlighted that. Like one person mentioned those North Korean soldiers, some of whom might be seeing the outside world for the very first time, and what that experience might be like for them.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
And what kind of stories they might take back with them, if they even can.
Right, assuming they're even able to talk about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It makes you wonder how something like that could change a society, even one as closed off as North Korea.
It's a glimmer of possibility, at least.
Yeah. Another comment that stuck with me was about the Ukrainian refugees. People who've had to flee their homes, leave everything behind, and try to start over in a new country.
It's heartbreaking to think about what they're going through.
It is, and it's a reminder that the effects of war, they ripple outward. They impact people far beyond the immediate battlefield.
Absolutely. And those impacts can last for generations.
So given all of that, what can we as individuals do to help, to alleviate some of that suffering?
Well, there are a number of organizations doing incredible work on the ground, providing humanitarian aid to those who've been displaced, who've lost loved ones, who are struggling to survive. Donating to those organizations is one very tangible way to make a difference.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. Are there other things we can do besides just donating money?
Absolutely. Educating yourself about the conflict and then sharing accurate information with others is incredibly important.
It's about fighting that misinformation.
Exactly. And then on a more personal level, if you have the opportunity to connect with Ukrainian refugees in your community, I think that can be incredibly powerful.
Showing them that they're not alone.
But exactly. Offer them support, friendship, a listening ear.
Okay. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the future. Do you see any reason for hope, for a peaceful resolution to all of this?
Well, it's difficult to be optimistic when things seem so volatile, but as you said earlier, hope is essential, even in the darkest of times. And I do think there are a few reasons to believe that peace is still possible, however distant it might seem right now.
I'm happy to hear you say that.
Yeah.
So what are some of those reasons? What makes you hopeful?
Well, one thing that's been really remarkable is the unity we've seen from the international community in condemning Russia's actions.
Yeah, that's true.
The sanctions imposed on Russia are unprecedented, and the outpouring of support for Ukraine has been really heartening.
I think that sends a really strong message that this kind of aggression will not be tolerated.
Right. And despite the Kremlin's attempts to control the narrative, there's still significant anti-war sentiment within Russia itself.
Yeah, you see those protests, even though the government is cracking down. It shows that people, even in authoritarian regimes, they still have power. They can still make their voices heard.
Absolutely. And lastly, I think it's important to remember that diplomacy, while it can be a long and messy process, is really the only path to a lasting peace.
So even though we hear a lot about war and escalation, there are still people working behind the scenes trying to find a different way forward.
There are, and those efforts deserve our support.
Well said. Well, on that note of cautious optimism, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure as always.
The pleasure was all mine. And to our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious.